unmute yourselves. We also have two guest panelists today, David Martimort and Ludvig Sinander. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming. And we are, as usual, let me remind you that we are recording and streaming this on YouTube as well. Okay, so again, this is the last talk, so we'll see you again back in the fall. In the meantime, Piotr, the screen is yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Francesco. Thanks a lot for having us in this great seminar series. I think everything has been said, so I'm just going to jump right into it. This is a paper about property rights. Property rights are important. I don't have to explain that here to economists. Basically, since Coase and Williamson, we understand that the assignment of property rights matters, particularly in the presence of transaction costs. And as a result, there are trade-offs associated with the optimal design of property rights. So on one hand, we know that if we give strong property rights to the owners, this incentivizes them to invest in what they own. On the other hand, very strong property rights might conflict with reallocation of resources in the future when we find new efficient uses for those resources. And they could lead to market power and concentration that then impacts the distribution of surplus. So this paper is, as the title suggests, trying to tackle the question of how to optimally design property rights. We'll get to applications towards the very end of this talk, but if you want to have one application in mind, you can think of something like designing a spectrum license. So basically, when regulators design a spectrum license, they have to answer these questions and resolve these trade-offs. If they give a very strong license, meaning a license giving the holder a lot of rights for a very long amount of time, that gives the holder of the right good incentives to invest and maintain the good, whatever this is. On the other hand, these very strong spectrum licenses then make it difficult to reassign property rights, to reassign spectrum to new users when new efficient uses of spectrum arise. And we actually witnessed this with the incentive auction, where the government had to basically design this auction to redistribute those rights. It was quite complicated because the spectrum licenses were so strong. Now, I want to be very specific about how we're going to think about property rights in this paper. We're going to take a very particular approach. We're essentially going to think of a property right as determining the holder's outside options in economic interactions with other agents. Okay, so property rights can do lots of different things, but we're just going to think about them as giving the holder of the right certain options that holder can execute without consulting or getting approval from anybody else. It's just a set of outside options that are available in economic interactions. To make it slightly more specific, let's think of a sort of classical full property right. What this property right says with respect to some underlying economic good is that no matter what terms of trade I face in the market, no matter whom I'm facing in an economic interaction, I always have the outside option just to keep the good, right? There's one thing I can do, I can just keep it. Contrast this with the opposite extreme of not having any right to the object, then my outside options kind of normalize to zero. I don't have any rights to the object. If I want to have the object, I have to buy it in the market. I have to bargain with somebody else. I have no guarantee, no outside option with regard to that good. And then the reason why this paper exists is that there are things in between. This is kind of a question of design. To give you one example of something that's in between a no right and a full property right, it's an option to own. So this is a type of right that gives the holder the option to keep the good or gain access to the good by paying some pre-specified price. Okay? And there are lots of other things in between. We're going to talk about examples of other types of property rights that are more flexible than these classical property rights. And so the key modeling idea, and I hope this will be very clear from a simple model I'm going to present today, is that the designer cannot directly control the allocation of resources in this economy, but she can design the agent's property rights, which is essentially the agent's outside option. Okay, that's the whole idea of how we're going to model property rights. And this perspective, although it's simplified, it misses out on some of the aspects of property rights that are important for many applications. This will allow us to characterize the optimal property right using a mechanism design approach. Okay, so we'll actually be able to derive the optimal form of property rights from a very large non-parametric class. And a very brief preview of results. I decided to keep this intro relatively brief. The optimal property right in our framework will be simple. Now, the simplicity will be driven by the simplicity of the setup, so I don't want to oversell this. More importantly, it's going to be more flexible than a conventional property right. And in fact, oftentimes it'll feature or resemble this option to own, where essentially the type of the optimal property right will be to give the holder of the right an option, an opportunity to gain access to the good by paying a pre-specified price. Okay, that's going to be the main result, especially in the first part of the talk. It turns out in a full model, the optimal property right is a bit more complicated. I'll get to that. I want to spend more time than usually on the literature, given the importance of this topic in economics. The way we see it, there are sort of two large literatures that emerge from Coase and Williamson, and they essentially studied two different types of transaction costs. One is private information. So there are classical papers like Morrison Satterthwaite that point out, essentially, if you think about Morrison Satterthwaite in terms of property rights, what it says is that property rights interact with efficiency of allocation when there's private information, right? In particular, there's impossibility of efficient allocation with two-sided private information when you assign property rights fully to one of the parties. We also understand from subsequent papers that this negative result can be relaxed if property rights are more balanced. So this is sort of one big literature. The other big literature is the one on incomplete contracts, basically, where the sort of friction that's being studied is the incentive to invest, right? So we also understand that assigning these property rights affects how people invest, what kind of investments they take before they transact. And this has been studied in the incomplete contracts literature, going back all the way to Grossman-Hart, Hart and Moore, and in the subsequent literature. So the sort of one-sentence summary of our contribution to this literature is that even though these options to own were studied before, in particular, I highlighted in bold font the papers that looked at options to own in the context of these two frictions, we're going to be the first to actually derive them as optimal from a non-parametric class. So these papers that I highlighted, they kind of look at these options to own by assumption. They assume that this is the class of contract that's available, and maybe they optimize over the price in the option to own, or they show that you can or cannot achieve first best. Instead, we're going to derive them as the sort of optimal or second best type of contract from a non-parametric class. And our model, even though it's simplified compared to both of these literatures in ways you're going to see, it's going to include both of these frictions. We're going to have a hold-up friction and a private information friction. So the way I would like to think about it, even though this is kind of giving ourselves maybe an undeserved praise, but it's kind of a refreshed framework. It has these elements, but it's geared more towards market design applications. And as I said, I'll get to applications at the end. We're interested basically in applications where one of the interacting parties is a regulator who has more bargaining power. And so in a sense, the biggest difference to the incomplete contract literature is that in that literature, the main question was sort of who should be assigned the property right. And the person with the property right had not only the control rights, but also more bargaining power. Instead, we're fixing bargaining power and we're modeling property rights as determining outside options for the agents. And I think you'll see it immediately in the model. Okay, there are other papers which are less closely related. There's one closely related by Julian, 2000. I'm going to actually get to this later, and I will revisit some of these papers on this slide later in the context of our results. So this is the right time to ask any questions. If you have questions about the big picture, as I said, this was a short introduction. I want to jump into the model.
Can I ask a quick question? Is there a sense in which the property right is it seems like the way you were phrasing it, but maybe I'm reading too much into it, is kind of allocated to somebody. It's like a good itself that can be maybe allocated,
right?
To,
yeah.
But it's not divisible. Whereas, are you going to allow for more general things like a joint property right or something like that? I'm not arguing that this is going to be optimal, but something like that. So how general is this?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see the slide the model in a slide or two. We don't currently allow for a joint property right. That's actually on my last slide in the future directions. We want to think about how to assign these property rights across multiple agents. For now, we're essentially fixing the distribution of bargaining power and fixing who owns the right. And we're just saying, what is the optimal design of the right? And I'm glad you asked this question because this allows me to kind of talk about the second pitch that we used to use for this paper. We no longer do it. which is that in mechanism design, what we typically do in 95% of papers, we fix the good that's being allocated and talk about the optimal allocation mechanism, right? That's typically what we do. And here we do something opposite in a sense. We are fixing who owns the good, but we're designing the good. Essentially, that's what the question here is. So, if the spectrum license, the good is the spectrum, but what exactly does it mean to own spectrum, right? We're designing this good because we have to design what it means to own the spectrum. Does it mean that you can use it in unrestricted ways? Can you hold it for, use it for 10 years, 20 years? Can you renew it when the lease is up? Things like that. So we're essentially designing the good that's being allocated, and therefore we purposefully abstract away from the allocation problem itself. So we're going to have a single agent, and always that agent is going to hold the good, which is the property right. And I think you'll see in the model exactly how it works.
Can I just ask, so you try to draw the distinction between bargaining power and outside options, but it's not obvious to me that there is such a distinction, because I think of bargaining power as having the power to take actions unilaterally, and that's exactly what an outside option is.
I'm fine with that. What you'll see in the model, essentially in 2 slides, it'll be very clear. Basically, there'll be a principle designing the mechanism, and then the agent will have outside options. So what I mean by fixing bargaining power is that even if the agent holds the good, it's still the principle designing the mechanism. But you're absolutely right. If the agent has full property rights, the agent will always be allowed to keep the good. It's just that the agent will not be able to design a mechanism and propose it to the principal that we keep fixed.
Yeah, but I guess if the agents had access to the full space of all possible allocations, she could effectively design a mechanism.
I guess that's right. I think there's a distinction between bargaining power in the sense of who gets the surplus in the end, and sort of procedural bargaining power in terms of like what's the extensive form game.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks.
And okay. I think it's good to show the model because this is going to dispel most of these doubts. And in fact, the plan for today, which is an experiment, so if you have comments about that, let us know, is that I'm going to talk about a very simple model first, in which
Can you tell us a little bit more about what is as a start of the story? I mean, if we are thinking about an asset, somebody owns it at the start. So there is always a date 0 where the asset is owned by someone.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, finding the optimal allocation of property right has its own set of participation constraints coming from the initial allocation of right that we start with in life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have something to say about that, or are you going to choose this allocation of property right ex nihilo?
Yeah, we don't have much to say about this, and this is kind of a purposeful choice to abstract away from the allocation of the property right. And one way, I'm not sure if it helps, but if you think about the spectrum application, there it's really the government controlling that spectrum at some point in time, and they have to assign these rights. And the question is simply, what rights do we assign to the spectrum? Do we give property rights?
In this case, I understand because the principal is also the initial owner. But
yes,
in many circumstances, these are private party who bargain or who are in this contracting environment where they have to invest, and they start with an initial allocation of right.
That's right. I think
there is nobody who tell them who should have the right.
I agree. So certainly this will not fit all of the applications. This is sort of why I hinted at the fact that we're going to be more interested in this market design applications, whereas the regulator controlling the good to some extent, as well as the rights. And I probably won't get there, so I'm not sure I should get into this. But you can also apply this framework to a situation where essentially these are private parties, and the question is the party owning the physical resource is designing a license or some sort of contract for another party to use that resource. So in a sense, I think the answer to your question is we are implicitly assuming that whoever is designing the rights also has some control, at least initially, over the resource. In the spectrum application, the story I'm going to tell you later is one of time inconsistency, where the government controls the spectrum initially, but they cannot commit to an entire sort of future contingent plan of allocation mechanisms. So what they do is they design a property right, which determines what rights you have to the spectrum. And this will be a way of sort of partially solving this issue of time inconsistency, of being unable to commit to future allocation mechanisms. I hope this will be clear when we get to this application. And I guess I want to get to the model, because the model is much more abstract in a sense, and hopefully this will help with the interpretation. Unless there are other questions. All right, so here's the simple model, and this is simple for many reasons, but the main one is that we're going to turn off investments. So I made a big deal of investment incentives. So we're going to turn it off for the first part of the talk, not because it's unimportant, just because we can illustrate the main sort of mechanics of the model without investment. It simplifies the exposition quite a bit. I'm going to add the investment in the second half of the talk. And the model then becomes 2 slides. We're going to start from a standard contracting problem between the principal and agent. So first, we're going to draw a public state omega from some distribution. For now, this is unimportant, but you're going to see why I want to have this public state. We're going to have an agent with a private type theta, draw some distribution, and there could be correlation between omega and theta. And we're going to have a principal choosing a trading mechanism that can depend on the public state, but that screens the agent's type theta. This mechanism must be chosen subject to IC and IR constraints. X is the allocation, T is the transfer. And it's a linear mechanism design problem. The agent's utility is just theta times X minus T. So theta is essentially the value for the good being allocated by the principal for the agent. And then the principal maximizes some objective function V theta omega of the allocation, and she puts some positive weight on revenue, on the transfer T. Okay, so we can think of the principal maximizing, for example, her own revenue or efficiency or some other objective. Okay, so that is a completely standard problem. And now we're going to depart from this in just a single way. We're going to think of an ex ante stage in which a designer, who's not the principal, or at least has different preferences than the principal, is going to specify the agent's property rights. And these property rights is going to be essentially a menu of outside options. Okay, so the designer here, before this contracting happens, is going to choose a set M of outside options that are going to be available to the agent when contracting with the principal. And these outside options consist of, or are basically pairs of allocation probabilities and transfers. And it's an arbitrary set. So in this sense, we put no restrictions on what these outside options could be. Okay, I'll get to interpretation in a few slides. Okay, and the agent can basically execute any one of these rights from the menu when they contract with the principal. Okay, these outside options are available when they contract with the principal. The designer is going to maximize her own payoff function that also depends linearly on the allocation and transfers. It's the same functional form as the principal. It's just there is a star indicating that these are potentially different functions, a different weight on revenue. Okay, so, and it's important for especially this part of the model that this is a different function than for the principal.
So why the designer cannot commit to an incentive compatible
mechanism
that will specify xi as a function of some theta at and blah blah blah.
Right. No, that's the key assumption, is that you cannot commit to a mechanism that's contingent on the future event of contracting between the principal and the agent. And again, I'm going to refer to an example, the spectrum example, where it might be very difficult for the FCC, for example, when they design a spectrum license, to commit how spectrum auctions are going to look like 50 years from now. But what they can do is they can assign a property right or give a spectrum license saying, these are the rights that you have to this part of the spectrum for this many years. These are the terms under which you can renew it, etc. Right? What they cannot do is they cannot say 50 years from now, there's going to be an incentive auction that will take the form of a second price auction with no reserve price. In part because the government can change in the meantime. They can elect a new FCC and completely change that.
So if you do that, don't you fall into the Maskin-Tirol criticism of the incomplete contract literature?
I'll talk about this at the end. We don't, because we're going to have private information at the contracting stage. Now, Maskin-Tirol have a footnote saying that they believe the result still holds with private information at the contracting stage. In our framework, which is a bit different from Maskin-Tirol, it's not true. So we won't get into that. But I have a comment about this. The reasoning that mass controller proposed has some force here. It doesn't make the problem degenerate. It's some force. I'm going to talk about this at the last slide, if it's okay.
I suppose you're assuming that alpha star is weakly positive, not because it would be crazy for it to be negative, but because it would trivialize the problem if it were negative. Is that right?
It wouldn't trivialize it. Strictly speaking, there will be no solution to the problem for a reason that's sort of kind of silly. I can basically what the designer would do then. It would
just shovel as much money as possible.
No. Exactly.
Right. There's no bound on how much you could. That's what I meant by
Great. So we could actually, we talked about this right before this talk. In some applications, we want to have alpha star negative, but then we'd have to put some bounds on the TIs in the menu.
Yeah.
And then it works.
Thanks.
Good. And some technicalities just to close the model. Everything is very nice, continuous, compact, has positive, every distribution has continuous positive densities. Okay. Very quick comment. The linearity here of this mechanism problem is somewhat important for our techniques. So we don't think that this is crucial for the economic results, but certainly some of the simplicity of the results you're going to see are driven by the linearity, and we're heavily relying on this for our techniques, which I'm going to talk about in detail. Okay, so now this is, I think, the sort of the most fun slide in a sense, because I hope to show you that this modeling approach can actually capture a pretty rich set of conventional property rights. Essentially, what these rights are going to do is they're going to create an endogenous or type-dependent outside option for the agent. And of course, the agent is going to execute the best available outside option for a given type. So essentially, this is this outside option. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what this menu could be, and that will capture many conventional rights. So one example is a full property right. Whenever you see a pair of numbers, the first number is the allocation probability, the other one is the transfer. So this outside option, where allocation probability is 1 and transfer is 0, this is just an outside option where the agent can always keep the good. So whatever the mechanism is that the principal offers, the agent has the option of just saying no and keeping the good free of charge. Okay, so this is a full property right. Here's another very simple outside option, just a cash payment. So this is what we talked about with Ludvig a little bit. This is currently allowed. You can just say, I have the right to a monetary compensation for relinquishing control as an agent. Here's a more complicated property right created by having two options in the menu. So this is essentially a property right with a resale option. So now I have the option to keep the good free of charge if I want to, but I also have the right to resell at a pre-specified price back to the principal, or just sell to the principal at a pre-specified price. Okay. Here's the one that I mentioned informally in the introduction. So this is an option to own or a renewable lease. This is basically saying the agent has the option to guarantee control over the resource, conditional on paying some pre-specified price P. Okay, this will play an important role. Here's something we call a partial property right. So this is a right that you can execute free of charge, but it gives you just some probability of having control of the good. You can think of this as, a court makes a decision and conditional on a good decision, I get to keep the good, otherwise I don't. You can think of this Y as capturing some sort of unmodeled geographical or time restriction on the right. And finally, just to illustrate the flexibility, we can even have a sort of fully flexible property right where the agent can guarantee any share or any probability of having control conditional on paying some price for that share. Okay, so that's what we can capture. Okay, and one last comment before I get to the results. So one thing, this is going back to the discussion with David a little bit. We assumed essentially that we are in an incomplete contracts world by saying that these property rights cannot be made contingent on that future state omega. Okay. And this is, we believe, this kind of captures the spirit of property rights, which are supposed to give you some sort of robust guarantees as the owner, and they should not depend on sort of fine details of the future state. That being said, it's actually very easy, especially in the simple model, to extend our framework to allow for some sort of contractible state S, which is kind of like a signal of omega that the designer can condition on. I'm going to show you how it works. It's actually very straightforward. They could be even perfectly correlated, in which case, essentially, you can condition on omega. What I'm saying is that this doesn't matter for the form of our results. It's going to be very important for the economic implications, but in terms of results, mathematically, this is totally fine. We can handle it. And two uninteresting cases, just to kind of make it, put some boundaries on the model. If the designer and the principal have the same preferences, it's a trivial problem because then there is no reason to give any rights to the agent. Okay, so there's no time inconsistency or two parties with the same preferences. Just give no right to the agent. There's no point to give a right to the agent. This is going to change once we introduce investment in the holdup problem. And second, if the principal did not care about revenue, we assume that the principal does care about revenue, but suppose she did not, then property rights will be ineffective because the principal could just always buy out the agent's rights, and therefore they will be totally ineffective in determining the allocation of the asset. Okay, so that's why we assume that the principal cares about revenue for the property rights to have some bite. Okay, so I'm ready to state the main result. My plan is to spend some amount of time talking about the proof, and hopefully we'll get at least to the full model with investment. But at that point, I think the model with investment will be very straightforward to cover. Okay, so here's the main result. For the simple model that I introduced, an optimal property right always takes the form of a singleton menu with an option to own, okay, for some price P. Okay, so it's a singleton menu, and this is always sufficient in this simple model. And moreover, this unique outside option that is offered takes the form of an option to own. So this is a contract that basically gives the agent the right to gain control to the resource, conditional on paying a pre-specified price P. And disclaimer is that, well, we said that, but the menu will get slightly more complicated once we add back the holdup problem, the investment. Okay, so this is true only for the simple model, but you will see how the proof and the ideas extend easily to the more complicated case. Okay, so the plan is I'm going to, well, sketch the proof of this for you in the next 15 minutes.
Just to check, so the theorem doesn't assert that P is non-negative?
No. And in fact, depending, like theta can be negative and then P can be negative too, for example.
Yeah,
so we have some applications where it could be negative.
Thanks.
Okay, so the proof has a couple of steps. So let me walk you through the steps. First of all, this is actually very straightforward. Instead of thinking of this menu that the designer is choosing, we can equivalently think about just an outside option function R of theta. And this outside option function has to be non-negative, non-decreasing, convex, and has a slope bounded above by 1. This is very easy to see in one direction. If I actually choose this menu M for the agent then executes the best option for a given type. This is going to induce this outside option function, R of theta. And then you can also go in the opposite direction if R has these properties. It has to be non-decreasing and convex just as a result of incentive compatibility, essentially. So instead of thinking of choosing a menu, we can just think about choosing an outside option function R, subject to these constraints. Okay, that's what we're going to maximize over for the designer. Now let's look at the problem of the principal. So here, this is just the contracting between the principal and the agent. And I transform the problem a little bit using the usual tricks, using the Meyerson trick to just optimize over allocation rules, use the integral representation of transfers. So there's the utility of the lowest type and the allocation rule. I use the virtual surplus function to express the preferences over revenue. And the only difference here really to a completely standard problem is that now we have this type-dependent outside option constraint that will eventually be chosen by the designer. But I first want to look at this problem for a fixed R. So essentially, we're going to solve the problem backwards. We're going to solve the principal's problem for every R. And then in the second step, we're going to optimize over R. Okay. Now, we're not the first to look at this problem. For a fixed R, this is something that is well studied in the literature. And one of the sort of most important papers on this topic is by Julien. This is JET 2000, where he essentially proposes a solution technique based on duality to solve this problem. The idea is you put a Lagrange multiplier on the continuum of these constraints. So it's a CDF basically, and you can solve it. And in fact, we could. This is how we started. We actually used Julien's techniques. We proved strong duality, and we were able to tackle this problem. But we needed some assumptions on top of what we assumed already. And then we realized there is actually a different approach, which we have subsequently developed, that allows us not to make these assumptions. So I'm going to talk about this alternative approach to solving this problem. So this problem, we sort of know how to solve this problem. We're going to propose a new solution technique that will avoid some of the assumptions. And we think it's slightly more transparent because it doesn't use duality. It's very direct. In fact, it's based on ironic. So we're going to adapt Meyerson's ironing to solve this problem, okay, instead of using duality. And this will also give us some intuition for the optimal structure of these proper rates, which is why I'm going to cover this in some detail. Okay, to give you a little bit of intuition for what's going on in this problem. So we have this objective function W, which is derived from the original objective B, and this multiplies the allocation rule. So naively, what the principal wants is she wants to set x to 1 when W is positive. Otherwise, when W is negative, she wants to be x to be as low as possible. But of course, it's bounded by the outside option. Okay. Now there are sort of three complications here. Why can't we just sort of pointwise minimize the allocation to hit the outside option? Well, first of all, this may violate monotonicity of x of theta if W is not monotone. Second, you can't actually minimize x pointwise because, as always in mechanism design, when you change the allocation for one type, it affects the information range for all the other types above. And finally, it's not clear that you want to minimize the allocation rule when you want to hit the outside option constraint, because you can also satisfy the outside option constraint by paying the agent using the transfer function instead. Okay, so these are roughly the three complications, and how you resolve these trade-offs is going to actually be addressed by adapting this ironing technique from Myers. Okay, so I'm going to describe how it works and then explain a bit why it works. So to be clear, we're using Meyerson's ideas, but this does require some extra proofs and steps that we have to put together. So what we're going to do first is integrate the objective function of the principal. Okay, this is the usual step, and then concavify it. Okay, so what I'm going to show you in this graph is in the top panel, you can see this integrated objective function, which we're going to concavify. And in the bottom panel, what I'm showing you is the allocation in the type space, where R of theta is going to be the outside option. I'm going to show this allocation in the utility space, because I'm going to construct the allocation, an indirect utility essentially in this mechanism, which pins down the allocation rule, of course. Okay, so here's how it works. So you concavify this integrated objective function of the principal. Then there are two special cutoffs. One cutoff is basically where this function has slope 0. This is effectively when this is the integral of the objective function. So if you differentiate it back, the slope corresponds to the original objective function, just ironed, concavified, right? So the slope 0 means that this is where the objective is turning from negative to positive. So when the objective is positive, there is no conflict with the outside option constraint because the principal wants to give the good to the agent anyway. So above some upper threshold, theta upper bar star, you always give the good to the agent. The outside option constraint is slack. There's a second cutoff at the bottom of the distribution. This is where the slope of this concavified objective is equal to alpha. Now, alpha is a special parameter. This was the weight on revenue. Okay, so this is saying to the left of this cutoff, giving the good to the agent is so bad that the marginal value of the principal is lower than the marginal value of cash. So below that threshold, instead of giving the good to the agent, I prefer to buy out the right. So what I do is I just give the agent a cash transfer here, which is again what makes this constraint slack. To the left of the lower cutoff theta lower bar. Okay, so this is sort of simple. This takes care of the two boundaries. Now in between, what's going to happen is we're going to use ironing. So the ironing intervals are where the concavified objective is strictly above the original objective. And in these intervals, we're going to have a flat allocation rule, which is going to basically have ironing regions. Okay, so it's going to be this linear interpolation that will only sort of bind, the outside option constraint will only bind at the two boundary points, but not in the middle. And in all the intervals where ironing is not necessary, we're going to hit this outside option exactly. Okay, so this is kind of a mechanical procedure of solving this problem. You just plot the integral of the objective function, concavify it, you find the two cutoffs, and then you find the ironing intervals. Outside of the ironing intervals, you hit the outside option exactly. In the ironing intervals, you do this linear interpolation. Okay, that's it. And we think that the appeal of this approach is that we didn't have to do any guessing. Because when you use duality, you have to kind of guess the right Lagrange multiplier. And what Bruno is doing in his paper is he has to put enough structure on the problem to kind of be able to guess the Lagrange multiplier. Here we sidestep this because we just use ironing. And it tells us where you need to have a flat allocation rule and where you hit the outside option. Okay. Now, how am I doing on time? Okay, I want to tell you just very briefly why it works, why ironing works. So the new constraint is this outside option constraint, which looks like this, right? The indirect utility function of the agent has to be above this outside option function R. But if you rewrite it using an integral form, so of course the indirect utility is given by the integral formula, and you can also rewrite the outside option function the same way because it has all these properties. It's convex, increasing, and so on. If you look at the constraint this way, then this should remind you of something. This should remind you of second order stochastic dominance, right? This is saying that the allocation rule that you're choosing has a second order stochastic dominance relationship to this allocation rule defining the outside option. Okay, and essentially the reason ironing works is that ironing on an interval is basically like taking mean preserving spread of x treated as a distribution. Right? If x is increasing, if you think of this as a CDF, what ironing is doing is putting all of that mass in the distribution at the two boundary points, and taking a mean preserving spread of the distribution preserves the second order stochastic dominance relationship. This is why we can sort of iron the objective and then the allocation interval by interval, and this will preserve that constraint. Okay, that's roughly why this works. There are some connections to recent work thinking about these second order stochastic dominance types of constraints. Okay, so that's why it works. Now, what's the big deal? Why is this useful? Well, it turns out that the designer's problem. So now we're back to the designer's problem. Okay, we solved the principal's problem. Now we're back to choosing the optimal R function. Okay, and this we believe is kind of a marginal contribution here. The fact that we can also now choose the outside option. So it turns out this problem is linear in the outside option function. Okay, that's the big deal. That the designer's problem of choosing the optimal menu, once you transform it into choosing an optimal outside option function R, is a linear problem. Okay, and why is that? Well, the key observation you can sort of see from the ironing procedure, and the key claim is that the allocation rule used by the principal depends linearly on the outside option. Okay, and in fact, I want to show you this in the picture. Why is the dependence of the allocation rule on R linear? It's because these cutoffs that define the different ironing intervals and the different regions are completely independent of R. If you remember how I determined these cutoffs, they are fully determined by the upper panel, which just depends on the objective function of the principal, and in there is also the density, the distribution of types. But it has nothing to do with the R itself. So these cutoffs are independent of R. And then within every interval in the type space determined by these cutoffs, I'm just doing a linear transformation of the R. Right here, it just doesn't depend on R. In the ironing intervals, it's just a linear interpolation. And in the non-ironing intervals, it's just a derivative. So it's a linear transformation interval by interval, and the cutoffs determining those intervals are independent of R. Okay, that's why essentially if we double the outside option, we also double the allocation rule. If you take a convex combination of outside options, the optimal mechanism will be a convex combination of the respective optimal mechanisms. Okay, that's the linearity. And because everything, the objective functions depend linearly on the final allocation, as a result, they also depend linearly on the outside option function. Okay. So we have a linear objective function, and that basically is the end of the proof. Now, basically, instead of thinking of maximizing over a convex function, again, you do the usual trick of representing the convex function as an integral over an increasing function. Think of that increasing function as a CDF. So now the designer is choosing a CDF, a distribution, to maximize the linear function. We have an extreme point being optimal by the usual reasoning. Whatever. What is the theorem, Ludwig?
Power is the usual name.
Yeah, I think so. What is this? Okay, this is the usual.
Power is maximum principle. Is what Benny Moldavani calls it anyway. Good.
So that's what we use, and we get that a degenerate distribution is optimal. A degenerate distribution means basically an option to own, right? It's an allocation rule that's 0 and then 1 at some cutoff that we call P. Okay, this gives it the form of the optimal menu. This is why it's a singleton and it's an option to own. Because in the end, the problem reduces to maximizing a linear objective function over a convex set. Okay, that's the proof. Questions about that?
Can I ask? I mean, I probably don't follow this as quickly as Ludwig, but so I understand the extreme point gives you the x0, 0, 0, 1. Okay. It's less obvious to me that then you could also have to pay a p, or so it's a transfer bit that I'm not entirely clear how this. I mean,
so that p is basically the cutoff at which you jump from 0 to 1. If you write it down, you'll see it immediately.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks.
So how much of this can be generalized to the case where there will be the x won't be 0, 1, but the quantity should be.
That's a good question. We don't know. To be honest, we just haven't tried yet. And as I said, I think we rely on linearity quite a bit. I think it's a very natural next step to think about whether this would extend to a nonlinear case. The one thing that sort of immediately breaks down.
In that case, the dual approach
seems to have an edge. I agree.
Will still continue to hold.
I agree.
In general, in this environment, we have the guess and try approach works pretty well. And
I think that's so. I said this, but let me give you more detail. That the first time we solved this problem was actually by proving strong duality essentially in Julian's paper, and you can use it. You can prove strong duality and then prove a result that the dual variable, the optimal dual variable, is invariant to R, the outside option, and that gives you the same linearity. So that approach at least extends in the sense that it's a well-defined approach for the nonlinear version of this problem, but I'm not sure if the result will hold. That we just haven't tried, and we'll probably try at some point. Okay, let me give you a quick illustration, then I want to get to the full model of investment, and I only have 15 minutes left, maybe 20. So here's a very simple illustration. Don't think of this as an application yet, just an illustration. So suppose the principal is a seller of a good and she maximizes revenue. The state omega is the opportunity cost of allocating the good to the agent. So it could be like a production cost, or maybe it's an opportunity cost in the sense that if I don't sell to the buyer, I can sell to somebody else. And V of omega represents the expected social opportunity cost. And if it's just the cost for the seller of producing it, maybe V of omega is just omega. But if the seller is selling it to somebody else, because the surplus could be split with the eventual buyer, maybe V of omega is higher than omega. Theta is just the buyer's value for the good. And suppose the designer cares about allocative efficiency, right? So the tension here is the designer gives property rights to the agent, because if the agent has no property rights, then the seller, who's a monopolist seller, will implement the inefficient allocation for the usual reason to maximize revenue. Okay. So that's a very sort of simple illustration. The first best is, of course, a VCG mechanism. So if coming back to David's sort of comment earlier, if we could commit to a mechanism, we would just commit to a VCG mechanism where the price will be V of omega, will be just equal to the social opportunity cost. We can't do that. We assume there's no commitment. The only thing we can do is design this property, right? And so by the theorem I've just shown you, the best you can do in this case is to endow the agent with an option to own with some price P, which essentially is saying that the agent has the option to pay the price P and obtain the good, kind of bypassing the seller. Now, one quick intuition here for why this is kind of an attractive class of contracts is that it's kind of interpolates between the two extremes of no right and full property right. And in fact, the P set optimally by the designer will be on the whole spectrum depending on the specification here. When P is low, when the price is very low, this contract will approach a full property right. This will basically be a contract where the designer says, this monopolistic screening by the principal is too inefficient. I'm just going to give the good to the agent always. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice this opportunity of giving it to some other use. On the other hand, P can be very high. This basically approaches no right whatsoever. This is like saying, I prefer the principal to have full flexibility here, even though this is going to lead to some inefficiency. And we can say more about the optimal P under some further regularity conditions. I want to cover this quickly. So essentially, to say more about the price, we're going to impose monotonicity assumptions. So the usual monotonicity of the buyer and seller virtual surpluses, and monotonicity of the objective functions in the agent's type. if you make these assumptions, essentially what this says in this ironing procedure, you don't have to iron in this interval in the middle. And so we get a result that actually is already known from Bruno's paper, that in this case, you just have these two cutoffs. And in terms of the principles problem, it's going to be that below that cutoff, I'm going to buy out the right. Above the cutoff, I'm going to always give the good to the agent. In the middle, I'm going to match the outside option. Okay, and these two cutoffs are determined by very simple conditions, which are basically saying that the upper cutoff first, this is the second condition, is the cutoff type at which the principal will just sell the good to the agent in just a usual mechanism. The lower cutoff is the cutoff at which the principal would buy the good from the agent if the agent was the initial owner. Okay, so these two cutoffs are determined in a very simple way. And under this monotonicity condition, we can characterize the optimal price. Let me show you. This is the formula in general when omega and theta could be correlated. Let me show you a simpler expression when the type of the agent and the public option omega are independent. Essentially, what this price is the conditional expectation of the social opportunity cost, V of omega. But it's important what we condition on. What we condition on the event that the price in the contract ends in between those two cutoffs. So these two cutoffs are basically determining the interval in which the outside option constraint has some bite. Again, importantly, we have to condition on that. And the reason why we condition on that is that if he falls outside of these bounds, then essentially the option to own has no bite. If the price is below the lower cutoff, it has no bite because the principal will just buy out the contract anyway, so it doesn't affect the allocation. And if P is above that interval, then it also has no bite because the principal will want to give the good to the agent anyway. And so you have to condition on the price being in a range where it actually has some bite. It actually influences the allocation. And so I want to actually show you some closed form solutions here. We're not really able to show much more than this at this point without putting more assumptions here, but I do want to remark that because of this conditioning, this is a fixed point problem as a result, and the optimal price could be quite far away from the unconditional mean of that V of omega. So the optimal contract here is a bit more complicated than just saying, I implement the VCG mechanism on average. It's not quite true, because this conditioning can actually change this optimal price quite a bit.
Sorry, if you assume that V of omega is omega, and you allow uniforms on both distributions, presumably you can construct.
Yes. No, we can calculate things. If we put some numerical assumptions, we can solve it.
Because it'd be nice to see how that compares to the seller's profit maximizing price, and so how close to efficiency you can get.
Good. So so essentially the reason why I don't have that is that we came up with this illustration yesterday to illustrate a simple model. But we're gonna work on that more. One thing I can tell you about how close you are is that I mentioned this extension that you can assume that the property right can be conditional on some contractible state S. And if that's the case, then things become modified in an almost trivial way. You just have to condition on S additionally, and that allows you to kind of see that if this contractible signal S gets close to omega, it's almost a perfect signal of omega, then in fact this will converge to the first best, essentially. There is a small detail here because it's still not quite true that the designer can commit to this being the mechanism, because this is just an outside option available to the agent, and so the principal can still decide to buy back the agent's right. So it doesn't still approach the first best, quite exactly, but you can get close to first best if you can condition on some signal that correlates with omega. If you can't observe omega at all, then you're going to be far away from the first best. Okay, I want to cover the model of investment. I have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to that, unless there are questions about the simple model. Okay, so let me now add back investment. I hope that now things will be quite clear, because the mechanics of the model is quite similar. But now we have to complicate the model, so I'm going to show you the timeline. So now the timeline with investment is going to be as follows. First, the designer determines the set of rights. These rights are given to the agent. And so this is coming back to David's question earlier. We're not going to model the stage at all. We're just going to assume that the agent gets the rights. And this is something we want to work on in the future, endogenizing the stage. Then the agent makes an investment decision. I'm going to show you this bit in a second. This will pin down the distribution of the public state and the type of the agent. They will realize, and then the principal will choose a trading mechanism, just like we had in the simple model. And just like in the simple model, the designer is choosing these rights that have to be respected by the principal when the principal chooses the trading mechanism. And you can sort of see, I'll get to this later. Now the property right, these outside options have an additional role of essentially making sure that the agent actually invests. Because if the principal chooses this trading mechanism in a sequentially rational way, there is no guarantee that the agent will want to invest. In particular, if the principal extracts too much surplus from that investment, the agent will not invest. And so now the second role of property rights is going to be to incentivize the investment by the agent. Okay, so that's how we modify the model. And just to specify the new stage of investment, so this is just the timeline, and in terms of the physical time, is going to be time 0 of choosing the rights, time 1 when the agent invests, time 2 is the contracting stage. Okay, so what is happening exactly with the investment? We're going to model it in a very simple way. I'll talk a bit about how we can extend this. The agent either invests or doesn't invest. Investing costs C. Okay, if I invest, then things unfold as they did in the simple model. If I don't invest, then both the public state and the type are drawn from a different distribution, and the agent's value is lower. So essentially, the role of investment here is it increases the agent's value from the resource. Okay. We're going to look at 2 cases. So investment could be contractable or non-contractable. In the non-contractable case, this investment decision is not observed, it's private, and hence cannot be contracted upon. So there is no way to verify that the agent invested. So these property rights have to be completely unconditional. In the contractable case, the investment decision is observed, and the agent's right may be contingent on investing. And in fact, we're going to assume that the designer always wants to incentivize investment. So in the contractable case, you only want to give the agent's rights if the agent actually invested, and you want to give them the agent no rights if she didn't invest. Okay, but we're going to look briefly at these 2 cases. Okay, so that's the model with investment. We just kind of inserted this investment stage in between where the designer chooses the rights and the stage where the principal designs the mechanism. So what is the main result now? Well, as I said, it becomes a bit more complicated, but it's still a pretty manageable problem. So this time, the optimal menu will be binary at most. So at most, 2 types of rights are offered. One of these rights is an option to own. So in this sense, the result extends. The second one could be more complicated. And I will tell you more about what the second option looks like, depending on whether investment is contractable or not. So I'll get to that in a second. Okay. And the proof is essentially the same. The reason why it's the same is essentially now, because we assume the designer always wants investment to happen, we just have to add an obedience constraint to the designer's problem. Right? I maximize the same objective function as before, but now on top of that, I have to satisfy the investment obedience constraint, making sure that when I choose this property right, the agent actually wants to invest. And this is just adding a linear constraint to the problem. It's a linear constraint because the agent's utility depends linearly on the allocation, and the allocation depends linearly on the outside option. So now we have a linear maximization problem with a single linear constraint. So there is, I guess this is now, the credit here is due to Letros Tamala and Deval Spreda. And there are actually some other instances of this result in the literature, where if you have a single constraint, you need to have a convex combination of 2 extreme points. And that gives you those 2 options in the menu. Okay. Questions about that? Now, you might ask, isn't this driven by the investment being binary? Yes and no. So if you have k linear constraints, by the same reasoning, we're going to need at most k+1 options in the optimal menu. So in this sense, the answer is yes. It becomes more complicated if you make the investment problem more complicated. However, what actually matters is the number of binding constraints. And so here's an example with a continuous investment choice where you still just need 2 options. Suppose the agent is choosing some sort of continuous effort level, E, subject to a strictly convex cost. And then E is the probability you draw your type from the higher distribution. as opposed to the lower one. It turns out that if you want to incentivize some investment level E star, it's sufficient because of the convexity here to just satisfy the first order condition. And so even though there's a continuum of choices, you just have a single condition that's binding, which is the first order condition. The first order condition is linear in R. So again, you're back to having a linear problem of a single linear constraint. You need at most 2 options in the optimal menu. So this is the sense in which the optimal property right is still relatively simple, even when we add back the holdup problem. And the final result I want to cover before I guess I have to conclude is how does this second option look like depending on the contractibility or non-contractibility of the investment. And the bottom line is as follows, that in the, let's show you everything. In the contractible case, which is the case where essentially you observe the agent's investment, you can make the rights contingent on that. The second option is very simple. It's a cash payment. Essentially what you do then, you offer a lump sum payment for investing. You say to the agent, if you invest, I'm offering I'm promising you a cash payment. And that of course relies on investment being observable and contractible. The more interesting case is when it's non-contractible, then the second option in the menu is always going to take this form of a partial property right, where you promise the good to the agent with some probability at a lower price. So under this property right, the agent can pay a higher price P to guarantee control over the resource, or pay a lower price P prime and have some chance of getting the resource. That's the form in general. And the reason why you have to do this is that if investment is not observable, non-contractible, paying the agent cash achieves nothing. You have to rely on the fact that investment is increasing the agent's type. And so this property right is designed to kind of shift more rents to higher types, which is incentivizing the agent to invest. This is the logic behind this result. Okay, so Francisco, do I have time for one application? Can I?
Yeah. As I said to you, it's an hour plus or minus 5 minutes. Okay. So just go ahead.
So I'll show you one application, which is the one I mentioned in the beginning. We have 5 applications in the paper. I'll mention them in case you want to ask later. So the first one is about spectrum licenses. The second one is about regulating a private rental market. Essentially, if a business rents a space from a landlord, what kind of contracts should be allowed? We look at optimal procurement contract motivated by this issue of how should the government contract with a private producer of vaccine, for example, what type of promise they should make to them. We look at patent policy, and this I mentioned in the conversation with David earlier. We also look at a setting where 2 firms contract with each other, and this result has some implications for what type of long-term contract a firm wants to offer to a smaller firm who becomes the supplier. Okay. We look at a ratchet effect, essentially. There's a big firm and a small contractor, and the big firm will learn the small firm's costs over time, and they cannot commit not to exploit it in the future. So they offer this property right, which is essentially a long-term contract, giving that small contractor some sort of rights because of the ratchet effect. But I want to show you the spectrum license application, unless, again, later I'm happy to dive into any of the other applications. Let me show you a picture instead. So here's the same outline, but now with the application. So the property right design is essentially the FCC, this is the US case, I guess, designing a spectrum license. And they are interested in maximizing efficiency of the allocation of spectrum in the future. As I said, they cannot commit to a future plan for sort of contingent incentives, or spectrum auctions. Okay, so this is a problem where it's the FCC moving both a designer as the principal. It's a time inconsistency story. They cannot commit to how they're going to run their auctions in the future, but they can commit to a property right, to a license. Okay, so they assign the license to, say, a TV station. The TV station then decides how much to invest. Maybe it builds infrastructure around the license. That infrastructure, that investment determines both the TV station's value for keeping the spectrum for the future and potentially the opportunity cost. So that opportunity cost realizes, maybe FCC realizes now we have a better use of spectrum than to give it to a TV station. So there's a new spectrum auction. Okay, and of course the FCC has to respect the terms of the license given to the TV station. And the 3 sort of frictions here are: there's contractual incompleteness. This is the inability to commit. all I can do is give these outside options embedded in the property right. There's a holdup problem because the TV station might be worried that if they will lose the spectrum license in the future, they will not invest efficiently. And there is this time inconsistency issue. The way we model it is we say, in the future, the FCC could potentially put some weight on revenue. Even though ex ante they want to maximize efficiency, when they run the spectrum auction, they might care about revenue. The reason being that the government might actually impose that. So for the incentive auction, for example, the government did impose a revenue target. Okay, so they had to worry about revenue as well, which then distorts the efficiency of the allocation and could create holdup for the agents when they anticipate this, right? So the question is how to design a spectrum license when I cannot commit to future auctions. I know I might be tempted to maximize revenue in the future, but I still want to incentivize investment and ensure an efficient allocation in the long run. Okay, so if investment is contractable, so if I can actually observe that the TV station or the owner of the license invested properly in maintaining the infrastructure, then the optimal license is quite simple. This is a lump sum payment conditional on investing, which you can basically interpret as, so in practice, these licenses sometimes have minimal coverage requirements or some other sort of proper maintenance clauses. You can implement that as basically imposing a fine for failing these requirements. But if the owner doesn't fail, they don't have to pay. There's like a lump sum payment for investing. And then the key aspect is that there's a renewable lease. So you pre-specify a price in the license at which the holder of the license can renew the license for the next term in the future. Okay, you give them the right to renew at a pre-specified price. So that's when investment is observable. When it's not observable, non-contractable, this is probably the relevant case. So we cannot actually verify that the owner of the spectrum invested properly. Then the optimal license has these two prices. So the holder of the license has the opportunity to renew the license for sure at a pre-specified price, or they can choose to pay a lower price and renew the license in the future with some probability. Okay, so this is in general the form of the optimal license. And we can say more about that form of the optimal license, which then becomes simpler if we put some assumptions. So if we assume things are uniform, so the distribution of types is uniform 0, 1, if the firm invests, otherwise it's 0, then we can say much more about how this optimal license looks like. I'm going to look at 3 cases depending on preferences over revenue. So alpha and alpha star are the weights on revenue. Alpha star is kind of this ex ante weight that the designer puts on revenue. Alpha is the weight put by the principal, so in the future. If they both care about revenue, then an option to own is optimal. And you, in fact, set the price in the option to own exactly to make that investment obedience constraint bind. So you set it low enough so that the company wants to invest in the infrastructure. On the other hand, if there is time inconsistency, so ex ante, the FCC only cares about efficiency. They don't care about the revenue. But ex post, maybe because of this revenue target imposed by the government, they care about revenue as well. Then it turns out that the optimal property right is quite different. You actually give a partial property right, which just gives the company a probability y, which is less than 1, of being able to renew the license free of charge. And roughly the trade-off between the first and the second case is that if the regulator cares about revenue, then this contract is more effective because it actually raises some revenue. If the company actually executes that right and wants to renew the license, at least they pay the price P. If they don't care about revenue, this turns out to be a more effective way of incentivizing investment. Just giving this partial property right where the allocation probability they commit to is just high enough, again, to induce investment. And finally, we can recover one classical result. Suppose that the FCC doesn't care about revenue even in the future. So there is no time inconsistency. What this means is that even in the future, the FCC is going to run an efficient mechanism, a VCG mechanism. And this is a classical result due to Rogerson 92, that when you use a VCG mechanism, it actually it induces efficient investment. So when the future designer doesn't care about revenue, then it is optimal to give no right. And that's because the fact that the principal uses a VCG mechanism in the future is already taking care of the proper incentives to invest. Okay, I think I should now wrap up. So this is the application in a nutshell. As I said, we have all these other applications that I'm happy to come back to. but let me summarize. So what I talked about today is a simple, but hopefully you'll agree that flexible framework for analyzing optimal design of property rights. You can think of these property rights as partially restoring the commitment to future trading mechanisms in a world where the designer cannot fully commit to future mechanisms. And kind of the punchline, the takeaway is that these options to own seem to be playing an important role, at least in our linear model. So I guess it's a very important question for the future, whether this will continue to be true in a non-linear model. Some future steps. So let me just cover a couple of these. So I'll come back to that because we talked about this with David earlier. There's this famous Muskin-Terol critique of incomplete contracts. Essentially, in our framework, we can rephrase it by saying, shouldn't the designer design a menu of menus and then let the principal first select the menu from the menu and then let the agent choose an outside option from the menu? And the reason for doing that is you can achieve some screening on Omega, even though we cannot contract on Omega directly. So what we know is that this can help. So if you give this more flexibility to the designer, you can in fact do better. You will actually offer a menu of menus, and you will achieve some screening on Omega in an incentive compatible way. But this does not make the problem trivial. You cannot restore the first best solution using this trick in our framework. Mostly, I think, because the agents still have private information. Another extension that we're very interested in is, as I emphasized, we kind of fixed the distribution of bargaining power. We had a principal and an agent. And even if you gave full property rights to the agent, it was always the principal who was designing the mechanism. So one question we want to answer at some point, probably in a follow-up paper, is what if you have two agents and the assignment of property rights also leads to redistribution of bargaining power? And to whom you allocate the rights? And maybe most importantly, whose rights takes priority, right? So if you could give some rights to both of the agents, how do you resolve conflicts between them? This is essentially this could potentially apply to things like eminent domain. How do you determine whose rights have priority when there's a conflict between them? How do you allocate rights to both parties or multiple parties over the same resource? We modeled these property rights as options available to the agent. There's kind of a dual approach of prohibiting the usage of certain allocation transfer pairs by the principal. So one example of that is something like rent control. Instead of the opposite of giving the agent an outside option, it's saying, as a principal, as the seller in this market, you cannot use certain prices. So you can sort of think of outside options kind of a lower bound on what can be achieved, and then you impose an upper bound on the principal by restricting certain things. So you can see how they could sort of meet in the middle and restore the full commitment solution, but it's kind of interesting what happens in the middle. And the final comment I want to make is that, as I emphasized multiple times, we don't model the allocation of property rights. This goes back again to, I think, first question by David. We don't model how these property rights are allocated in the first place. And so one future direction, we have something to say about this in the paper, but not much, is what if you also choose to whom to allocate these property rights in the first place? You can have multiple agents, and you design the optimal property right, but at the same time, you design an allocation mechanism to allocate those property rights. This is especially important for example, the spectrum allocation problem, where, yes, you are designing the spectrum license, but you are also designing the current spectrum auction. And there are interactions between those two problems, because depending on the design of the spectrum license, you are changing the bidder's willingness to pay for the goods you're selling at the auction, which could then influence the shape of the optimal auction. Okay, so that's all I had. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Piotr. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask David and Ludwig if, which in whatever order, if they have any further comments or questions.
David, you first. Okay. No, David. Well, yeah, I just well, one thing that came to mind, which is partly inspired by I think your third bullet on the last slide, and also by what Hector Lopez was writing in the chat, is that it seems natural, even when the principal doesn't have private information, to allocate outside options also to her. So to give her power to take certain unilateral actions. So, at least, to give her maybe one option. And I mean, there's sort of two versions of this. So I think what Hector had in mind in the chat was that maybe there's just certain inalienable rights that the principal has, which the designer can't take away from her, which is something that you are giving to the agent already, right? That the agent can always guarantee yourself a payoff of 0. But you could also think about designing those, right? You might want to give the principal the option of something, so it's sort of potentially interesting and maybe quite natural.
Absolutely. Yeah, some sort of like eminent domain again, right? Where like, if things are really horrible, the government can always step in and say, look, we'll make an exception. We just take this stuff away from it, right?
Yeah.
That's a great question. We sort of purposefully for this, first of all, we think of this as a beginning of an agenda, hopefully. And so we didn't want to do everything in a single paper. The paper is already too long. And so the idea was really, let's just focus on the design of the good, the property right. Let's fix the allocation completely. Let's not change anything else. But obviously there are lots of extensions, and I'm glad you find it interesting.
David?
Yes, I think maybe I would like to pursue on this. There is an asymmetry again between the principal and the agent in this model, and one might think that this theory of incomplete contract has been developed in framework which are much more symmetric.
Yes.
The allocation of property right should impact all parties at the same time. So this is something important, I think. Also, even if the techniques are beautiful, the robustness to the non-linear case is not immediate, and in particular, again, the duality, the approach by duality may turn out to be more powerful in those general framework.
Yeah, this is a well taken point. So on the first point, yes, this is why we want to consider this extension to a symmetric case, precisely because we want to speak directly to the incomplete contract literature. So that's what I meant when I said at the beginning that what we do is more geared towards these market design applications, where there is a regulator, and that kind of justifies the asymmetry of the bargaining power. From a more technical perspective, what this gives us is this very clean separation between who designs the mechanism and who holds the outside options. That is behind a lot of the tractability. That's sort of why we were able to characterize the second best type of property right, which, as far as we know, the incomplete contract literature has not accomplished. So there are many papers showing the optimal property right, but only when it achieves the first best. So the type of papers like Noldeke and Schmidt has 2 papers on this. There are other papers. This one by Eric Maskin as well. They show that you can achieve the first best with a certain design of property rights. But as far as we know, there is no paper deriving the second best in a world where the first best is not achievable. And that's sort of that's I think is the gain of, or like, the benefit of this framework. We pay some costs. The other cost is the linearity, which you don't like. One thing is, again, it's a first step. I think there are many sort of canonical papers in the mechanism literature that are relying on linearity as well. And so, baby steps. I don't know what else to say. But I think that one other thing I want to say, I guess, is that for some problems, linearity is the right assumption. If you're allocating an indivisible good, like maybe the spectrum license, this is just the right assumption. And so at least for some applications, I have some confidence that what we do is sort of the right model to study. Obviously, we would love to extend it to nonlinear problems, because that will allow us to cover other applications as well.
Another question I had is that you assumed implicitly that any money the agent pays goes to the principal, or vice versa, for the closed system. And I guess it's quite natural actually to think about the designer being someone who maybe likes tax revenue or something like that. So the money could be potentially diverted to the state or something like that. So joint taxation and property rights design. I mean, it would sort of speak to this debates, for example, about the land tax and this sort of thing. It might be, I mean, it's clearly an extension, but it might be quite an interesting one.
Yeah, I agree. So it is true that alpha star right now is interpreted as the value that the designer places on a transfer from the agent to the principal. Now, in most applications, not all, but in most of them, the principal and the designer are the same entity.
Yeah.
It's just that, so then it's, but now I'm wondering if the transfer made by the agent is given to some third party. I actually don't think this changes the math. It probably doesn't change. Well, actually, I'm not sure. I was
It's
thinking
a
about
management extension, certainly.
Yeah, for sure. What we really want to do is actually look at the alpha star being negative. But then we're a bit worried that we have to impose some constraint. And one constraint we could impose is to say the principal can just never pay the agent.
Yeah.
That's sort of a tempting thing to assume, but that doesn't quite work here, because sometimes you get these payments just because the principal wants to buy out the right. It turns out to be optimal, and it seems weird to restrict the principal from doing that. So we have to find some clever way of putting some bounds in the transfer so that we can talk about alpha star being negative. The reason for that is that we're interested, this is our second application, where we think about regulating a rental market. So you have a landlord and a tenant, and the question is, should you regulate these contracts in any way in terms of whether you can extend the contract? And the idea is that maybe this is more for businesses than for private parties. If you're a business, you rent some space and you put some sort of equipment in that space, then the landlord has enormous power over you in the sort of when it comes to renewal, because now that you put in all that investment up, you don't want to give it up, but they have bargaining power, right? So this is now the question of, should the government regulate the type of contracts by saying, for example, the business always has the option to renew the lease. And that's what we get as a result in our paper. And that's what exists, I believe, in the UK, actually, is that there are some laws saying that if you're a business renting some space and you have the option to renew the lease, conditional on paying some price. So yeah, we are into, oh, sorry, I forgot why I was saying this. Now I remember. Now back to the case of private parties. If it's actually a poor person renting an apartment from a rich person and you have redistributive preferences, then in fact you want to put more welfare weight on the renter compared to the landlord. But that leads to alpha star being negative, which right now gives us the bizarre conclusion that you just want the landlord to pay an infinite amount of money to the renter, which makes no sense.
But it seems to me that the question of how reasonably to constrain the allocation space, it seems to dovetail nicely with the question of, shouldn't the principal have outside options too? It seems like solving those two problems might be something that would happen in tandem, perhaps.
I agree. Although the other thing that's sort of missing from the model, which would be relevant here, this is what David asked earlier. What about the sort of ex ante stage, -1, where the sort of property right is like somebody actually owns that apartment and somebody signed the contract in the first place with the tenant. So the thing is, we don't currently endogenize that. And of course, if you have a contract saying, oh, by the way, the landlord should pay $100 to the tenant when they renew the lease or whatever, then of course they can just charge that $100 up front when they sign the contract in the first place. So to really get at this, you had to explicitly model, I think, the initial stage as well. It's not, I don't think it's just adding more options for the principal, but either way, this extension of adding outside options for the principal is certainly an interesting one.
Sorry, I had some trouble unmuting myself. So David has to go. So thank you, David, for
thanks a lot.
Us. He's already gone. So I'll send him an email, I guess. Can I ask? There's a lot of issues here that are really interesting, and basically everything is being brought up in some form or another. I'm wondering whether, going back to in this slide that we're looking at, your bullet point number 3, whether a brutal way of looking at this is, for example, assigning an exogenous probability of each of the principal and the agent being, well, each of the two sides being a principal or an agent, and something that you cannot decide. I mean, it's just the future. It's going to be maybe another government, another regulator with different preferences for you. It's just what you've got. And that might be relatively easy to deal with, right? So that might address, because there is this, I think what people have pointed out is that in some ways there's an issue how much bargaining power do you have through the outside option, but also being the principal gives you bargaining power, right? Yeah. So,
No, we could probably do that. Yes, like the easiest solution right now is to say with some probability that's exogenous, it's the agent proposing the mechanism. That actually does nothing basically, because in that case, right now with the model that as it currently stands, the agent can extract all the surplus because the principal has no private information. So that's a cheap extension that kind of achieves that, but it's not that interesting because it's trivial. Now, so we'd have to make omega a private information of the principal. Now we at some point, I don't actually remember if we talk about this in the paper because we had it, then we took it out. We thought about what if omega is the private information of the principal, and it mostly doesn't change the model if we assume it's private information of the principal. There are some subtleties, but because then you get an informed principal problem. So, but if you deal with the subtleties, you can do that. And then I agree that then you could just say, if omega is private information, then let's just give some bargaining power in the sense of designing the mechanism to the agent with some probability. That's a well-defined model. And then you also want to give some outside options to the principal.
Yeah.
But we kind of want to, we think this is important enough and interesting enough that it's more like a follow-up paper than an extension at the end that, you know, it's going to tell us to put it on an appendix and no one will ever read once the paper is published. So we think this deserves, you know, a full treatment.
I mean,